Hello and welcome. I am Michael Kessler, a faculty member in government theology and law at Georgetown University and the managing director of the Berkeley Center for Religion, Peace, and World Affairs. We're grateful and excited to be hosting today's event in collaboration with the Pulitzer Center on Crisis Reporting. Rebecca Shaw will be the moderator of today's conversation. Rebecca currently serves as principal investigator for the Religion and Economic Empowerment Project funded by the Templeton Religion Trust. She is also a senior fellow at the Archbridge Institute and formerly a colleague and research fellow at the Berkeley Center. Now based in Bangalore, India, she is a pioneering scholar of the impact of religion on the social and economic lives of poor women in the Global South, particularly in South Asia. Welcome back, Rebecca. We're so looking forward to your perspective on these issues. As our special guests, we have Philip Martin and Dr. Suraj Yengdi. Philip Martin is part of a GBH News Center for Investigative Reporting team that explores caste discrimination in the US in their Pulitzer Center supported project. He is an award-winning senior investigative reporter for GBH and a former senior fellow with the Schuster Institute for Investigative Journalism at Brandeis and a Harvard University Nieman Fellow. Martin also served as NPR's first national race relations correspondent from 1998 to 2001. Dr. Yengdi is a senior fellow at the Harvard Kennedy School and an inaugural postdoctoral fellow at the Initiative for Institutional Anti-Racism and Accountability at Harvard. He is author of Caste Matters and speaks widely about his experience as an academic activist and a noted public intellectual in the transnational movement of Dalit rights. Thank you both for being here with us today. Welcome to Georgetown. Before I turn things over to Rebecca, I have just a few quick notes. This webinar is being recorded and the captioned video will soon be posted to the event page on the Berkeley Center website. If you registered for today's event, you will receive an email with the captioned video when it becomes available. In the last 15 or 20 minutes, we will open questions from the audience. Please submit your question by opening the Q&A box at the bottom of the Zoom screen and typing in your question. Thank you all for tuning in, and now over to Rebecca.
Thank you, Michael. Thank you also to the Berkeley Center for hosting this very, very important event. Good afternoon to those of you who are coming from Europe, and good evening to those of you in Asia, and probably good afternoon as well to those of you in America. Many Americans would be shocked and appalled to think that caste could exist in colleges and corporations and other places across America. Most Americans would never believe that the deeply discriminatory and pervasive hierarchical system of inclusion and exclusion of ancient India is fully operational in Massachusetts as it is in Mumbai. A Dalit, person formerly known as an untouchable, who crosses the oceans to arrive in America, still carries with him his low caste status, one that confers upon him an irrevocable hereditary membership in a group that for millennia has seen him as ritually polluted and unclean. It is thanks to my two esteemed panelists who over the last few years through hard work have exposed the stigma of caste faced by Dalit Indians in America. And it is because of Philip and Suraj, for the most part, that we can talk candidly about this issue today. It is thanks to them and to other scholars, reporters, and activists like them that we are now able to ask questions like, what does caste in America mean at a time when most Indian Americans either don't admit to it or don't even know it exists in their neighborhood? What, if any, is the difference between racism and casteism in America? These are tough questions. And boy, am I glad I don't have to answer them, because we have here Philip and Suraj, Philip Martin and Dr. Suraj Yengdi, who will answer these questions for us and many more. Michael Kessler, the managing director of the Berkeley Center, read out their excellent bios. And I would like to just say one more thing about Suraj. Suraj actually happens to be the first Dalit PhD holder from an African university in India's history. He has published in the fields of caste, race, ethnicity studies, and interregional labor. And his recent work with philosopher Cornel West has received global attention. And I hope during the course of our conversation, Suraj will talk about this. Philip has produced an excellent series called Caste in America. You can read his bio at the Pulitzer, on the Pulitzer website. But it is this series of case studies and videos that has spawned so much discussion about this issue, and for that, I am very grateful. The structure of today's meeting will be Philip and Suraj will talk with us for about 40 minutes. We will then have about 20 minutes of question. As Michael said, I urge you to write your questions in the question and answer box at the bottom of your screen. Okay, welcome Philip and welcome Suraj.
Thank you, Rebecca, and to thank Georgetown and the Pulitzer Center.
Thank you.
So, thank you. Welcome both of you. I'm very grateful for your commitment to this issue and for joining us today. I'd like to just unpack this issue for a moment, if I could. I'd be very grateful to both of you if you could help us make sense of this very complex issue, caste in America. In my introduction, I talked about many people not in America, many Indian Americans, as well as many Americans not believing that it either exists, partly because they've never come across it or they've never experienced it. I'd like to make sense of this complex and troubling issue and ask both of you, Suraj, I think you're muted. I'd like to ask both of you to share a story or an incident that has deepened your own understanding and experience of what Dalits are up against here in America.
Well, we start with Suraj, and I'm going to tell you why I'm calling him Suraj instead of Suraj, because I've become familiar with him, and it's sort of a Detroitism. That's where I'm from originally, and so
Okay.
so as not to confuse the audience, if they hear me say Suraj instead of Suraj, understand that it is a regionalism and a preference.
And we are proud of your Detroit roots.
Indeed, indeed.
So Suraj, Suraj, can you start with the story and tell us how this, and help us make sense of this issue. So unpack it, if you will, for those people that are watching that are just baffled by the fact that caste even exists in America.
First off, just to take a cue from Brother Philip, I believe there's no correct pronunciation of a name, at least from me. It's just the melody that we have, and I appreciate that. To understand this, the question of today's conversation, we need to go back to the decades of 1980s, and especially with the ruptures within the global economy, and how slowly the panacea, quote unquote, panacea of poverty, panacea of inequality was going to be resolved by opening up the closed post-colonial gates of countries for a liberal global order. And what that meant was inflow of an economy, which is basically directed by the Western capitalist enterprise. And when they came, they offered us a solution that, if you open up your gates, if there is a liberalization, if there is a globalization, it would potentially resolve problem. What they did not understood when it comes to caste is locally constructed. And so my experience of caste is constructed in my locality. And when I say locality, you can add a circumference to that radius. But it is how it is being exercised, it is practiced, and eventually improvised for it to become more intimate, but also more spiteful. And this is where we need to start the story. Even though it's a localized form, and when we think about globalized form, the local disruption never happens. That was never an interest of the globalization or liberalization. And so through the flow of capital and of course some part of human resource that went away and outside, the local practices that were kept as a cultural form of something that needs to be preserved as a relic, which then of course come to other parts of the world. And it of course didn't start in 1980s, but that's one of the ways we need to understand how local cultures were preserved, and be it colonization or historical movements of various forms of violent and non-violent forces of the foreign audience. And so the story basically has a common template, and then if you add that on with any individual story, mine is no different either, where when I left my hometown Nanded, which I'm again very proud of, when I left, my identity as a Dalit coming from Nanded never left me. And what that meant was I interacted with people who belonged to different state in a different way than the way I would interact with people who belong to my state. And simply because there was, for me, a sense of fear and fear of reaction by the people from my region, because it's locally constructed. Even today as we speak, if a feudal caste person, or if a dominant caste person from my region, if shows up, there is almost an expectancy that I need to be reverent, I need to be subservient, I need to be quote unquote humble to that. And in a way, it's ingrained in my mind. And that's how we see the story of caste translate. So, wherever I go, be it United States, America, UK, Europe, or even in Africa, that line of inquiry remains as opposed to not. And I think that's the kind of, almost a slogan of modern global caste through this kind of maintenance of caste supremacy, because the space that we migrate to gives us more occasions to be freely casteist.
Thank you, Suraj. And I want you to hold, this was such a rich introduction. And I thank you very much. I like you to maybe over the course of the next few minutes, we can probably build on what you said about cultural relics and locally constructed caste, and how your Dalit identity never left you. You left Nanded, but it followed you. And so maybe we can talk about how, over the course of the next few minutes, how that's played out in America. So I'm just going to move to Philip here and ask Philip to maybe share a story. You did this wonderful series, Philip. And I urge people to watch it. It's available, I believe, on the Pulitzer Center website, and people can access it. So share with us a story. Help, as I say, unpack this issue for us.
Sure, Rebecca. Sure. Suraj, that was quite amazing. And Suraj, that was quite amazing. For me, Rebecca, this story begins many years ago. I had long heard the term untouchable. I think those of us in the United States who were read and learned it in any way knew the term untouchable and its relationship to India. It became more apparent and more, if you will, in my face when I worked for National Public Radio as a race relations correspondent, the NPR's first race relations correspondent. And in 2001, I went to Durban, South Africa for the United Nations Conference on Race. That's not the formal title, but that is the intention. It was a focus on race and racism, with a major focus on slavery, on the post-slavery period, on reparations. And the conference was splintered over the issue of Zionism and racism, and ultimately unsuccessful as a conference. But during this conference, there was a parallel conference going on, run by non-governmental organizations. And I, at that time, had a chance to speak with a number of individuals who identified themselves as Dalits. I had not heard the term, and then understood that it was basically what was formerly known as untouchables, people formerly known as untouchables. And they spoke of a need to address the issue of casteism. This was heavily resisted first officially by the United Nations, and because it was not seen as on par with racism and other isms that the conference was addressing. But in talking with folks, interviewing them with a microphone to their mouths, with a pen in hand, writing down their stories, I was I was hearing a lot of pain, a lot of anguish, a lot of concern for over 200 million individuals in India and many more around the world who were trying to address the issue of casteism. This, of course, was not just an Indian issue, a subcontinent issue. It was true for Burakameen in Japan, true for populations in Yemen, true for populations in Mauritania and Mauritius. Casteism is something that was clear, apparent, and painful. I had written a story on Dalits for the coming out of the conference. This was September 8th. Of course, September 11th, the United States was struck by major terrorism. And this story, as they say, went into the dustbins of history. It never aired. And it was, but that was my first repertorial link to the issue of Dalits and caste. And this issue persisted. I kept meeting people in the United States who talked about being persecuted, felt that they were discriminated against because of their caste. I had not done a story on it at that point. The opportunity came again when I applied for a fellowship with the Pulitzer Center in order to expand on this topic of casteism, and thus the series Caste in America. And I can elaborate as we move on.
Well, thank you very much, Philip, for that, for telling us about this journey that was really, in some ways, 19 years in the making, since that first encounter you had with Dalits in South Africa. So I wanted to ask you one more thing very quickly, to just tell us, you traveled to India to visit Suraj's family and to his village. And I just wanted to say, to what extent, how did that experience shape you? Because in our conversations previous to this, you talked about visiting Nanded, and what does that impact have on you, and how did it shape your own filming of this series?
Great question. I'm from, as Suraj and I were talking about earlier, from Detroit. Grew up in a segregated neighborhood, without question, a very poor neighborhood. And traveling, but as a reporter, of course, you put on your reporter's hat. But that doesn't mean that you don't juxtapose, you don't analyze from your perspective, but from your history. And so in 2018, I hopped on a flight with Suraj. We left from we both left from the United States, arrived in his hometown of Nanded. It was fairly amazing to see Suraj going through the airport, getting various reactions from, because people knew and know who he is. He's built quite a reputation as an advocate for Dalits and against casteism. And so people in the airport knew who he was. But leaving the airport was quite extraordinary, because he was greeted like this young man coming home, if you will, a young man who's done good. Not only has he done well in terms of his advocacy, but he's a Harvard scholar, a Dalit who is a Harvard scholar, is something that many people, not just Dalits, by the way, but folks I encountered across Nanded celebrated. They're proud of their native son returning to Nanded. And so it helped me. It was through Suraj that I told the story. I was able to talk about the sewer system that runs through his neighborhood and talk to young people who will never leave that neighborhood, whose lives are basically uh, encapsulated in a single moment. That moment is their lives, and that moment is the day they were born. They are considered again untouchable. They are considered the lowest of the low, and it was clear based on this my reporting that they would only ascend uh, based on how they were able to utilize governmental programs, how were they were able to depend on their communities, their ascendancy of to leave Nanded, to leave this particular section of Nanded, depended on how they were able to, if you will, move beyond the contours and the content of that which is supposed to shape them all their lives, caste. And it was through Siraj, I met Muslims, I met Brahmins, I met others who basically play a role in this play, in this drama that we call casteism. And that the result of that is this 4-part series, 5-part series actually, Caste in America, where we look at, in order to understand caste in America, it was necessary to understand what caste was in India. And from Nanded, we returned to the United States. And then we were able to look at a number of situations, including that recently involving Cisco, which you're going to talk about, but also other less known situations, waiters, waitresses, people who work in universities, others who've experienced casteism in the United States due to their through to the factor of their birth and how they are viewed based on that birth.
Thank you, Philip.
Thank you.
So Suraj, you're a role model. You've made it out of Nanded. You're at Harvard. You're a Dalit scholar, a survivor of the Indian caste system, and now you're part of some of one of the most prestigious academic communities in the world. I want to ask you, Suraj, did you expect to experience the intensity of caste discrimination, or really did you expect there to be caste discrimination and prejudice of the kind that you experienced? Because I know you have, and other Dalits experienced in the United States. Did you expect that?
I mean, first of all, on behalf of Nandedians, I would really like to express my gratitude to Brother Philip for coming. Probably, if it was not for you, Brother Philip, that story would have never come. I mean, usually you see the neighborhood how it is. Either if somebody is murdered or there is a violence of some sort, only that time that is reported. Otherwise, it's just, even you see the governor of the state, the former chief minister, lives right next to where we live. And so we still, and people still fondly remember you for really thinking that their story is also something that could be captured as a narrative of a journalistic enterprise, but also capturing in the camera. And still those memories remain. Rebecca, to your question, because I was already sensitive about caste, because if you grow in a neighborhood, it's not, people always ask me, when was the first time you know about caste? It's not like I went to a different country to discover, you're born in that. It's like asking a black person from Detroit, when did you realize about your race? That doesn't work like that. It's not the epiphany. It's not the moment of, resurrection that you realize. You learn how to navigate through the codes of caste. And through that, if you ask, how did you learn to navigate the code of caste is a question that has to be further investigated. When I came to America, in fact, when I went to UK for my first, I went straight from that slum to UK, another big university, to study. And that's when, because I had friends and I was Indian in my own, way. And because I came from, this is how it happens. When you come from marginalized backgrounds, the pressure on you is quite immense because you are told that you have to make your country's name, and, as if 1.3 billion are relying on me, but that's how they condition your mindset. And I was very not open. I was conservative in looking at things. But my other friends from dominant caste, two were Brahmins, one was Baniya, and because we lived in the same accommodation, we made friends. But eventually, when they realized through my Facebook post and that I was actively involved in condemning caste-based atrocities and advocating for it, they singled me out. And there was a moment where it would have been, intensely violent, but that incident did occur. And Philip captured that with my incidentally, another of my friend who was from my hometown was in the same university. And so I was violently attacked by a Brahmin from Delhi in the course of this. And what that means is he still thought that he can beat me and get away with it. I mean, you just don't do that in any country where law is protective. But why he thought that was because he was operating in an echo chamber that warrants him impunity, even though he is in that space. And that really left traumatizing experiences. They took away a file of my certificates for my graduate, all my, you have file of your document certificates, and they stole it. And so this is how it kind of follows you by, first of all, immediately facing you. And that's why many Dalits don't even bother talking about their caste. Many times they change their names or they lock their profiles, social media. They just don't want unnecessary negative attention. But also, these are direct. There are indirect ways of making you feel inferior. Caste discrimination also carries with a pride of someone upholding. So a person from dominant caste in America must be exercising their naturalized way of religious or cultural practices, but those are rooted in denigrating my status as a Dalit. You talk about festivities, you talk about how networks are made, how social groups are made, and you will realize that you're not really part of that. Although they will give you a face value, they will talk good about you. And these are, by the way, liberals who identify themselves as fellow liberals. But in exercise, if you investigate, and you know what, sometimes it's not easy to give a mathematical calculation like explanation about what caste discrimination is, because when you feel it, when you undergo that, sometimes it's the person who's oppressing you knows he or she or they are oppressing you. When you know the bystander might not register that tension because it's not vocal or it's not equivalent to their condition. And I think those are also subtle nuances that remain unacknowledged, but then that give you a sentiment of being victimized in this conversation of caste hierarchy.
Suraj, that's excellent. The last point you made about nuances. I know you and I and Philip, we talked about this, and we're gonna tease this out later on in a question, and maybe I hope we do have time because it's a very important issue. But I wanted to pick up on something that you said about your colleague or one of your students in the university, and also about other Dalits who sublimate their feelings and don't really want to talk about this, and so talk about caste and their status and how they're being treated. And I want to ask you, how does one start this conversation? I know that Philip's series and other ways in which you have worked with Cornel West and other academics and Isabel Wilkinson and others is bringing this issue out. I mean, today that we're talking about is it on at Georgetown is a sign that this issue is coming to light. And I know you've harnessed the racial protests and the issues of the summer for the last 2 years, and you've made use of that to some extent. But there are people that don't want to talk about it, and there are people perhaps who don't want to acknowledge it for other reasons. Could you talk a little bit about that in America? Talk about casteism. There are some. So if you could just explain that and talk a little bit about that.
Right. I think America needs no explanation on this because they can look into their own backyard, and they will find the rednecks and the white supremacists behave exactly similar. If you want to talk about equality, if you want to talk about oppression of black and brown folks, if you want to talk about the extreme disparity, these are the people who don't want to talk about. They just want to talk about a macro identity of the religion or nation. That's exactly the template used by dominant caste in America. They mimic that, but it's very ironical when they mimic it as a person of color or as a minority, which really misses out, or which really plays well into the hands of being oppressed at the same time as you are oppressing something else. And then there is a chosen ignorance over, you plead that you are unaware. I didn't even know this was caste, or I didn't know I was from this caste, or we barely talked about it. Those are these are the genuine excuses people think they are giving, but what they're essentially doing is they're validating their caste supremacist upbringing. They don't want to acknowledge that they could be part of a supremacist regime, because they are so conditioned to think about them as being a minority within a dominant white context. And I think, Rebecca, that is where we really need to revisit some of these social solidarities that we are creating in America right now, because it's all of a sudden, it's Black Lives Matter protest, George Floyd, and in of Trump. There is a whole lot of things happening, and then you see, of course, certain groups of the dominant, 90% plus of Indians who live are from the dominant caste. And so that's why you will never see the majority, and dominant caste in total, in approximation in India, are close to 17%. So what you have here is close to 17% of representation of people who represent themselves as Indians. So what we do is we miss out on close to 83% of diverse Indian ethic. And that's why you have celebrations in everywhere. Diwali, which is again a representation of dominant caste ethic. Diwali has a different Dalit interpretation. Of course, you have a celebration of Holi, which is celebrating the death of Holika, a native woman. Then what happens is it culturalizes, and for a white Christian guilt, that just suffices you, because you want to exploit the labor that is coming, but also at the same time you want to make sure your white supremacy, your status, your white caste that Isabel Wilkerson talks about remains intact. So you do that by propagating or promoting certain dominant caste voices, so they don't push you to the wall, so that your white supremacy is being challenged. And I think it's almost like trading off your supremacy when someone else's supremacy.
Well, thank you, Suraj. I mean, as an Indian Christian, I want to tell you, you talked about Holi and other festivals. And as an Indian Christian, I want to tell you, living in India as well as living in America, and I've lived in Britain, I was educated there, caste is alive and well in Indian Christianity. I mean, so this is, caste permeates Indian culture and is across religions. And as someone who has visited with and talked with Dalit Christians, I know this is a very serious issue. So, but I did like your phrase "chosen ignorance," and I will appropriate that if that's okay, Suraj. So, thank you very much, Philip. I wanted to talk to you. You and I have talked about, and you wanted to read a passage from Suraj's book, which moved you, but I want you to talk to me, Philip, a little bit about the everydayness of caste in America. As part of your filming, you discovered that this permeated life in America in some ways. Did it shock you? This everydayness of casteism in America? Or as a Black man living in America, were you inured to the ordinariness and the numbing everydayness of this terrible evil?
Let me put it this way, Rebecca. I think everyone is aware of racism in America, and that it permeates our history. It defines us. Isabel Wilkerson, one of the things she said, and I think it's an important point, she talks about the Civil War. She references the Civil War. And she says the Civil War is not just in the present, not just in the past, but it's in the present. And the reason she says that is because contrary to our assumptions about American exceptionalism, we are not so exceptional in that we still are plagued by extraordinary degrees of racism, systemic racism, which the current government, of course, does not recognize. Many people are only starting to recognize that there is something known as systemic racism, that's the everydayness of racism and casteism in America. Isabel Wilkerson frames this as caste because she sees that as defining what we experience. In other words, you can become a rich person, be African American in the United States, but still be defined as someone who is less than as a result of not just your skin color, but because of your position in society predicated on the fact that you were born Black, thus your caste. So you can have someone who is a huge Trump supporter, like Ice Cube, for example, the singer, but Ice Cube doesn't realize that he is still regarded as less than because of his race, and so that is where caste comes in terms of African Americans, in terms of Dalits, in terms of Indians live in the United States. There's something similar. You can become an engineer at Cisco and then suddenly realize, my God, I have a degree in engineering. I am smarter than most. And yet I have been relegated to a position in society because of my birth, which also, by the way, determines who people want me to marry or who I might in fact end up marrying because of the peculiarities of casteism. And of course, I'm referencing the Cisco case where the California Commission on housing, fair housing, and discrimination. I think I think I might have been convoluting that a little bit, but anyway, they have basically representing an Indian man, a Dalit, who claimed discrimination. He experienced discrimination at Cisco by other Indians. Now, let's get something straight. Indian Americans experience racism. We've had incidents, especially during the Trump era, where Indian Americans have been targeted because of their ethnicity, because of who they are. And you can have a situation where people can be targeted because of their ethnicity and who they are, but they still might not realize that they are engaged in a contradiction. They are targeted because many Indians are targeted because of who they are in the United States, but have no understanding of that they themselves may in fact be practicing another form of targeting, that is to say casteism, looking down and in fact acting against people within the diaspora, within the Indian diaspora, who happen to be from a different caste. So when Suraj was talking about, we call it subconscious racism, for example, when he was talking about folks not acknowledging their bigotry or not acknowledging their casteism, there, in fact, may be legitimate situations where people are subconsciously not acknowledging that, not understanding that they practice a form of casteism. The reason that, as you pointed out, this issue has got more prominence is because we're talking about it out loud. So folks who heretofore were not engaged in this conversation, they may be now, because all of a sudden casteism has been thrown in their faces. In the way racism, because of the Black Lives Matter movement, it's systemic racism rather, has been thrown in the faces of individuals. And what I was referencing with his book, Caste Matters, Suraj's book, Caste Matters. Yeah. Right here, by the way, and here's Isabel's. What I was referencing here is the tendency, if you will, to take those things that give comfort to the ideal of American exceptionalism and to highlight them. So we will highlight Martin Luther King's I Have a Dream speech, but will not focus on Martin Luther King's critique of the Vietnam War and of systemic racism that he gave at the Riverside Church before his death. A major speech that he gave about condemning American racism. And he did not talk about the dream in this particular speech. He talked about the nightmare of racism. And so the dream you can embrace because it gives hope. The nightmare gives you a sense of despair because it's predicated on reality. I'm like to read this for a section because it struck me as being very much akin to how we, as Americans, idolize Martin Luther King's dream, but are absolutely afraid to confront his nightmare, that which was a nightmare come true in the form of systemic racism, which pervades our society. In his chapter, Neo-Dalit Rising, Suraj writes, and this is in reference to B.R.M. Becker, the Dalit hero and the constitutionalists, who, like like Suraj, quite interestingly, went to the United States to study, in this case at Columbia, and became was in fact a renowned scholar. And of course, one of the writers of the Indian Constitution, the modern Indian Constitution. And he writes, Suraj writes here, the Constitution as a bearer of the state narrative suits the governing caste well. Dominant caste circles, liberal and progressive included, view M. Becker as someone who gave them the Constitution, a nationalist, at best a revolutionary constitutionalist who deserves recognition. However, by only upholding his constitutional acumen, and Becker's rather more important contributions to India's intellectual legacy are erased. His harsh critiques of caste Hindu society and the civic and human rights movements he led almost single-handedly are barely referred to. Similarly, Rebecca, Martin Luther King's harsh critiques of America's caste system are not are basically obfuscated when we celebrate his life retrospectively, obviously. When we celebrate Martin Luther King Day, we celebrate it in the context of the dream, but then again, prefer not to talk about his critique of systemic racism and America's caste system.
Thank you, Philip, for highlighting how important it is for us to see these two amazing thinkers, these two leaders, Ambedkar on the one hand and Martin Luther King, and see them and read them and understand their work in its entirety, not to be selective, to read King's dream as well as understand that he spoke about a nightmare, to talk about Ambedkar, the great constitutionalist, who was also deeply, deeply concerned about the state of his people.
Indeed.
Suraj, his own people. And so Suraj, Philip read from your book. Would you like to say anything? How would you like to contribute to what he said? Would you like to add anything to what Philip said?
Yeah, of course. Thank you for reading that out. And you know what happened? An excerpt of this was published in the Hindu, and Hindu is one of the largest circulating newspapers. And the Dalits took it in a different way. They couldn't understand the context because it was excerpt, and they thought that I am saying that I mean, of course, I made an argument in the book that relying on Constitution is not enough. We really need to find other avenues as well as alongside Constitution and not wholesomely dependent. And I think the caste that we talk about is also South Asia specific. And you know, one of the stories that you covered, especially about the Nepali and as well as the Pakistani. And also, Rebecca, you're absolutely right. When I say dominant caste, I am not, not saying only about one religion. I also mention about Muslim dominant caste. I also mention about Christian dominant caste, and of course the Hindu dominant caste, who really, and also Sikh, how do I forget, and who almost collaborate, at least in the UK, the Jain, the Sikh, and the Hindu dominant caste collaborated to put down the efforts of the UK Dalits, who were trying to get a legislation passed that outlaws caste discrimination. And you see, that's how solidarities are built. And these people actually share that value. They unite and condemn the other oppressed groups in this light. And I think that angle of inquiry really misses out, because even Nepali people in America are not immune, or they are very prone to practicing caste-based discrimination. And I was told similar example in the UK by a Pakistani who underwent this. In Pakistan, it's Islamic country, and that's what it is mentioned, but the Christians, mostly Christian converts, are actually Dalits. Even in India, close to 74 Christians are Dalits who converted to Christianity. And when it comes to Islam, where the lower caste, the Dalits and other lower castes, are close to 80% who converted. So what we basically do is we have to assess the demography of each religious representation. The Brahmins, for example, are not more than 4% of India's population, yet they control close to 48% of India's resources. They, in fact, their national income averages to more than 48% than the rest of the India. What that means is we are really living in an apartheid state, yet without calling it. And that apartheid state imposes a slow genocide that we overlook. In the past 10 years, 500,000 crimes were committed against Dalits. And there is no hue and cry about it. There is no recognition about it. And we know every day 10 Dalit women are raped. And this is government statistics. Now, we can't live in a country where 10 Dalit women are being raped, according to government statistics. And if you remove the government part, then of course the figure must be much higher. As you know, access to police and access to judiciary is so, there's so widening gap between the people belong to Dalit caste and the non-Dalit caste. And we saw that especially in the recent case in Hathras, where a Dalit woman who was Hindu herself was, and this is where we need to break the bubble of Hindu, where the rapists who raped another Hindu, but they raped because she's belonging to a lower caste Hindu. So the idea of Hindu is total myth. It doesn't exist. It's just for there to show, as opposed to Christian, as opposed to Muslim, or opposed to other religion. Otherwise, it's a mono caste identity. Everybody is trying to make sure their caste privileges are retained. And I think that fundamental difference has to be established, because the dominant caste who want to use Hindu identity is actually to represent a majoritarian view, when in fact majority don't follow. The rituals and celebrations and festivals and gods are different. Brahmins worship different gods than the Dalits, than the tribal people, or than the other lower caste people. People don't know about it. And eventually it was all of a sudden made a Hindu canon, which was easy for you to, of course, negotiate and deal with other colonial or as well as other religious parties. So I think there are so many myths that constitute around this. And one of the aims, hopefully, I mean, with the book Caste Matters, was to actually also, enlighten people about the nuances that we were talking earlier.
Thank you so much also, Suraj, for mentioning the impact of caste on people in Pakistan. I know that there is a scholar who is associate scholar of the Berkeley Center, Sarah Singer, who's done significant work on Dalit Christians in Pakistan, and I know she would appreciate, if she hasn't already met you, meeting with you and discussing with you her own work. I just wanted to, and you talked a little bit about the Hathras case, and of course we have other cases in India. I want to move, if I could, to talk a little bit about the gender dimension to caste in America. And I want to, this is Exposing Caste in America. And while Dalit women in India experience unspeakable horrors, my own work on the study of the intersection between caste and gender and economic uplift finds that Dalit women in South Asia are doubly marginalized. They are ill-served by both caste as well as gender discrimination. And I do this work in South Asia. I wanted to talk to both of you. And I know, Philip, that you have you have interviewed women, Dalit women, as part of your 5-part series. And I know, Suraj, across the continents and across America, you too have interviewed Dalit Indian Americans. I want you to talk a little bit about the gender dimension, because it is a very important dimension, not only for work in India, and my own work on economic uplift, but I want to just talk a little bit about how this plays out in exposing caste discrimination right there in the United States. So either one of you, whoever starts first, Philip or Suraj.
I'll start with mentioning the series. Thank you, Rebecca. I think you raised a really important point, and one that Suraj can elaborate on in terms of particularly the crimes, awful crimes against Dalit women in India itself. But it doesn't just stop at India's border.
Mhm.
I worked on this series with my colleagues Tinku Ray, with Kavita Pillai, with Arun Roth, as well as editors Paul Singer and Aaron Schachter. The second part of Caste in America, Tinku Ray's story, she interviewed a Dalit woman living in the United States who had attended a university here in the northeast of the United States. And she alleged that she was raped by an upper caste man. She went to try to address this with school authorities, and they did not believe the dynamics, that it was based on there was a rape. Yes, that part of she sought to substantiate, but she also tried to show that this was the result of her caste status as a Dalit woman and being viewed as less than, and therefore you can do anything you want with by an upper caste individual. And she said she was not believed. And if you listen to part 2 of this report, you can hear the anguish, the terror years later in her voice, in talking about this incident. Now, it reminded me in so many ways of people of color, Latino, Latina, of Latinx women Black women, Asian women in the United States who've experienced race, Native American women who've experienced rape, assault, and not believed, and statistically, basic, statistically assaulted on a large scale, and their crimes unsolved. As a result of how race operates in this country, race, which Isabel Wilkerson says should be seen as caste in terms of how systemic racism works in the United States. So that was one example. The other way I think that gender plays a role in all of this is through the notion of marriage. And caste, marriage and caste are basically in inextricable in how they work. You are supposed to marry someone from the same caste. The notion of marrying someone outside of your caste is seen as problematic. Now, many people will say, well, we no longer practice casteism, but yet the idea of marrying someone other than someone from your caste, from an upper caste person marrying someone from your caste, is seen as very problematic. You see it in the ads all across India, correct, Rebecca? You see
Yes.
you see it in ads here in the United States where folks are advertising for a husband or a wife. And caste plays a major role in that. Again, but again, it's women are treated almost in that regard, as chattel, as property, as someone who should be matched with someone of their same, if you will, stature and birth. That's the more accurate description. Finally, the juxtapositions, of course, are historic. African Americans, Africans brought to America who were enslaved people, not slaves, but enslaved people. The greatest, one of them among the greatest atrocities committed against people of color, Black folk, Africans who were enslaved was attacks and the rape of Black women. It's from Jefferson, Thomas Jefferson, one of our esteemed founders of the country, to of the rapes of the Jim Crow period, to continual assaults that occur now. You can see in that history a juxtaposition to what is happening in India. The feeling that these women are to be abused because of their status, their lack of social mobility, dictated by caste, the lack of basically being seen as less than because of their caste, and even more so because of their, or I should say, exacerbated by their gender.
Thank you. I've been told that I probably should start questions now, but I do want Suraj to thank you so much, Philip, for that.
Thank
and
you.
for sharing us
Mhm.
sharing that story with us, that deeply troubling story about the young woman in America, young Dalit woman. Suraj, I want to give you an opportunity to respond to the issue of gender and caste briefly, if you will, because I see there are so many questions and comments. One comment is, we've just got started, 1 hour is not enough. So clearly this is an issue that touched many. So Suraj, please respond, if you will.
Right. So caste is actually it's a woman's body, on her body and inside her body. Caste is, it's the breeding ground for caste, and that's how the genderizing of caste. So whenever I say gender, the emasculation of caste takes place in that form, in its most violent ethos. But actually, the primary victims of this caste is women, and actually more so Dalit women, but also other dominant caste women. They just don't see their victimization as a victimization of caste, because they want to privilege their caste. And I think that's a very tricky position they have been put into. And that's why you will never see the global feminist movement, if at all they're talking about caste or Dalit women, where they barely have representation of Dalit women into their broader political solidarities. You were saying, I mean, I would like to add two more contours to the Dalit women oppression. One is, of course, the caste, second is gender, the third is class, and fourth is the space where you come from. The space in India plays a very important role. If you're in small town, if you're in a slum, if you're coming from a protected suburban neighborhood. And I think those four layers make probably Dalit women the most vulnerable and most oppressed human on the face of the earth.
Well, seems like we have just a moment for one question. I'm sorry, I want to apologize. I'm going to print out these questions, and I know our esteemed panelists will answer it. But I want to, this is a question that is a very important question, because it will highlight the point you both of you made about interactions, about unconscious bias in caste. And we can legislate all we want to about caste, but it's these social interactions, the ones that you faced, Suraj. You haven't had a chance to tell us about that story, the incident that you faced at Harvard, where you felt so demeaned because you felt this unconscious, this bias that the person had against you because of your status. There's a question that comes about education. And I want to read this question. It says, as a first generation American NRI who is focused on K-12 education, how can we leverage knowledge and scholarship of caste to deconstruct it within our own NRI community, taking care to highlight how we might hold relative privilege in the context of America's caste system? And I want both of you to answer this, because this is a new generation, young Indian Americans, young Americans. How do we leverage this knowledge of caste to help our own Indian community and help the wider community?
I'll be very brief and let Suraj handle much of this question. But I think the first thing is forums like this one. You have to be out front in talking about issues that are very painful, that are hard to hear. And you cannot leverage anything if we're not talking about casteism as a reality, as an objective reality. If we talk about it as a supposition, and as something, or view it as an opinion, as opposed to an objective reality, there's no way first generation Indian Americans will in fact come to grips with something that is not seen as real. In doing this series, one of the pieces that we did that did not make it into the actual series was interviewing Indians in various communities. And one young woman I spoke to in a suburban Boston community said that that's not something they talked about growing up in Caste. And then she said, but some of my friends belong to the Brahmins club, and other friends belong to another club. Well, by belonging to the Brahmin club, you are talking about caste, but what you're not talking about is the role you play in the prolongation of caste oppression, and in an acknowledgement of your status, of your privilege. That privilege became apparent when they were talking about jobs, networking, marriage, so on and so forth. So I think, again, it's the notion of being in your face. We cannot talk about Black lives without talking about Black lives. You cannot talk about casteism without talking about casteism. You cannot talk about racism without basically hammering home the fact that you have systemic racism in the United States, systemic casteism in the United States, systemic casteism in India. It's a worldwide problem, manifest in various ways, particularly acute, of course, in India, but also within the Indian diaspora.
Thank you, Philip. Suraj.
Thank you.
Yeah, I think very briefly about that experiences at Harvard, and then, I will conclude with the point about what can we do. I know one of the questions, during Philip, I, and a few others did a panel in Boston about a year ago or so,
Yes.
where there was a question about how does the caste manifest? And sometimes, as I told, a person was just yelling at me from a dominant caste, and I could barely have a space to have that. And I think what we need to do to ensure that this dialogue is retained, is continued, is that I think we need to make caste a mainstream conversation. It has to be not a marginal conversation. It should not be a South Asian problem, but it should be an American question. And then I think that actually then will give us more perspective. The literature, the art world, the media, and the other cultural and social forms, and of course, economic forums as well, do not at all have sensitive around that. And so if we need to do that, I think we need to push an aggressive dialogue or a position on caste into these various forums that we operate. And perhaps because of this push, we might have more conversations.
Thank you, Suraj. Well, we unfortunately have to wrap up. We've run out of time. I mean, I can't believe time has gone so fast. It was such a wonderful opportunity for me, and I know for the many people watching, to engage with both of you. We're going to have to do this again. But like you said, Philip and Suraj, we need to have a conversation. We need to have a respectful, open dialogue about the legacy of caste discrimination. We need to be self-critical and honest. And I'm very grateful that both of you have started this conversation, have helped us open this issue and discuss it. And thank you to everybody watching for engaging in this very important conversation. Thank you, Philip.
Thank you, Rebecca.
Suraj.
Thank you, Rebecca, and thank you.
Good to see you, Suraj.
You too. And thank you to
care.
the staff who worked at the background, Ruth and the Pulitzer Center colleague, and Rebecca, to you. Very much appreciated.
Indeed.
And
the Pulitzer Center. Mm-hmm.
And the Berkeley Center for
And
organizing
the Berkeley
this.
Center, indeed.
Thank you.
Thank